All right, ladies and gentlemen, the big hand is on 9, and the little hand's on 9, the big hand's on 5, so it's time to start. The panel is the nuances of point of view. And I'm going to have the panel introduce themselves, and if they have any product to flog, projects they wish you all to know about, books that may be appearing in the dealer's room tomorrow when it opens, please feel free to talk about those now, and then forever hold your peace. But I also have a question for you. As you introduce yourself, I would like you to think about this very quickly. Do you have a point of view that you feel is your natural point of view? We don't want to talk about this too much yet, but just sort of for a sense of the panel, is there one that you most often use, one you find most comfortable, or failing that, the one you used in your last story? And we'll start down here. We have 2 Johns here. We'll start with John Chu. John?
Okay, hey, my name is John Chu. I'm primarily a writer, so I am the person who is not vlogging anything. Woohoo! Let's see, I've been published in Massimo.com. Let's see, and actually, it's Tor.com's the web. You can actually go there and read the stories from and I actually know why I'm on this panel. I wrote something very snarky but true on the Readercon questionnaire, which is that not only did I write a story in third-person future, but I managed to sell it to Boston Review. That said, third-person future is not my natural point of view. I think a sensible default is to really tie in on the main character, and there are lots of reasons why I do that.
Cool. Eileen?
I'm Eileen Gunn, and I write short fiction too. And I will have a book to flog coming out from Small Beer, the short story collection, next year in the spring. So I didn't say
pre-flog, right?
Pre-flog. It will be called Questionable Practices. And I always have a point of view. I think any of my friends play that, and I can invent one on the fly if an additional point of view is needed. I can do multiple points of view in any given conversation. I was in the debating society. That's what debating society is for. But I don't have a favorite point of view. My favorite point of view is my point of view.
All right. I'll be your server tonight. I'm James Patrick Kelly. I am also a short story writer, and this is something that's this panelist, the topic of this kind of is very near and dear to me because I really like to play with point of view, and so I would say just to start out that I guess third person type or hot or a close point of view, third person close point of view is probably my natural one, but I feel like I need to try different things all the time. So just as an example, I've sold some stories recently. I sold a story in cinematic point of view, omniscient point of view, 2 in close third, and 1 in first person plural. And so I want to talk about all these things later, but first, let's hear from Darrell.
My name is Darrell Schweitzer, not pleased to send a microphone to the other guy. I also, occasionally, a very occasional novelist, but I think my last short story was number 319. So I haven't done a lot, and I would have had the product to wave around, because I'm completely shameless, except I didn't get that box unpacked in time. Probably see me in the dealer's room tomorrow. I have 2 short story collections just came out in the last couple of months, all of which are warming up to the fact that PS Publishing is going to do a 40-year retrospective of me, which makes me feel very old.
Wow.
It says junior apprentice old farmer. I'm getting there. But anyway, once many years ago, I wrote a story in the second person point of view, second person present from the point of view of a corpse. But I haven't done this since. I suppose I am more given to first person, but not.
Okay, cool. John.
All right. Can you hear me? Is this on?
Yes.
My name is John Stevens. I'm a fiction writer and I'm also a non-fiction writer. I do reviews and I wrote a column for SF Signal. So if I'm going to flog anything, I'll flog that.
Yeah.
And the last story I had published was in November at Ceaseless Skies, which is called Storm of the actually tended to write in a very detached third-person omniscient. What I've come to find out, and that's something I want to talk about with the panel here, is the poverty of certain of these perspectives, and actually the one that's simply most impoverished right now is that one. And I'll try to explain it when we get into things like granularity later in the panel. Yeah, I've written in first person, I'm writing more first person now with my fiction. I'm trying to explore the different things that you can do with it.
So let me read the description here because it's full of assumptions, which is always a good place to start. When writing genre fiction, many authors begin with the approach that the first-person point of view is useful for horror and heroic quests to bring immediacy to the story. Third person is necessary for epic world building, and second person is too confusing and must avoid it. But point of view is not so cut and dried. How can we deepen and expand our ideas of what constitutes point of view to better understand it? That's bullshit. But what I'm very interested in this notion, and so I'm going to throw it to the panel. Are there points of view that are ideally suited to different genres? I mean, this person opines that we should be writing first person point of view for horror and heroic quests.
Oh, you mean like Tolkien?
Yeah, well.
Lord of the Rings in the first person?
Yeah. So I asked if you agree with that, or if you're looking at your own work, you think that you have useful points of view for any genre you can think of. Let's start with John this time.
It's actually good because I'm the co-writer of that description. This was actually a panel that I suggested with Mariah Crawford, who's a PhD candidate in English, who is actually writing her dissertation on the point of view. And actually, I think the original intention between when we wrote this, she couldn't be here, unfortunately. But when we wrote this was to sort of set up those ideas and then suggest that the panel should try to knock that down.
We're working on it.
Yeah. But I don't think there's any ideally suited POV for a genre. I think some can be more effective based on readers' expectations. Like some readers who want a crime novel that's really about a bad guy might want a first person. If they want a more procedural approach, they might want to see the third person get all the bits of information to put together, for example. I don't think there's any one that's ideally suited. I think it really depends on what the writer is trying to get across to the reader with their story.
So what do you think? Are there certain points of view that lend themselves?
One of the things is, one of the most common kinds of story, we mentioned mystery actually, is the most remarkable person I ever met. That one is best narrated by Dr. Watson. You realize the virtue of that one, where you have a viewpoint character who is telling you about a person more extraordinary than himself. The reason that works is, first off, to take the example of Sherlock Holmes, the reason that works is that Sherlock Holmes is so extraordinary and so brilliant that he's a lot smarter than Conan Doyle. So if Conan Doyle were to try to write from his point of view, it wouldn't really, he did it sometimes. It isn't very convincing. But we are willing to believe that we are as smart as Dr. Watson and we could have met this person. Therefore, we both have the story from the inside, from Watson's point of view, which is up close, personal, and intimate. And we also have an objective point of view at the same time, him describing what Holmes is doing. So if you're going to write a story which is focused on the most remarkable person you've ever met, I think that's the way to do it. Doing a most remarkable person I ever met as a third person would probably not work. Let's go.
It would have to be the most remarkable person she ever met. If you start off with I in the title, you're going to have to continue with I in the rest of the piece.
Yeah.
So, how about it? Do you have an idea for a point of view that is ideally matched to a certain kind of writing?
Well, I'm not a theoretician. I actually like to try different things and see what works. When I first started writing fiction, I loved first-person point of view, and then I went to Clarence. And Damon beat it out of me. Damon hated first-person point of view, and he really flogged me on it. And I started writing stuff in third person. I didn't attempt second person because one of our Clarion mates, Bob Morales, had done that so very successfully and scarily in one of his workshop stories that I was never going to try. That totally bizarre form. But First person, I like, because you can do all kinds of ironic things in first person. I think you can do ironic things in third person too, but it just interested me much more to be in the head of somebody who was kind of getting it wrong, and the reader understood better than the narrator what was going on. There are limitations to first person because you can't show stuff that is off camera, but you can talk about stuff that's off camera. After writing in third person for a while, which was like years, I lived in Eugene and I went to Kate and David's workshop in Eugene, and I would never brought in a first person story. It would have been worth my life and the evening getting lectured. But once I discovered I was totally blocked when I tried rewriting a story in the third, that had been in the third person into the first person. And I discovered that it opened like a flower. All of a sudden I could see what was going on in a way that I couldn't in the third person. I think I've gone back and now I can do that in the third person as well as the first. But it opened my head to envision things from a specific point of view.
Have you ever written a changed point of view in the manuscript?
I think I have written stories, a couple, where sections of it are in the first person and sections of it are in the third. I've never done one of those in which you know, 3/4 of the way through you tell off the first person narrator, and then it's a police report or something. I've never done that. I think I've done a couple. I would think of one, but I'd have to look at a copy because I can't remember. That's what you get to be willing to do. But where I think I did one that went between first and third, it was in postscriptures.
I've done this, and I found it very much like what Eileen is describing. If you get stuck in the story, I don't think I was ever very deep into the story, but within the first 3 or 4 pages, I realized that the story wasn't talking to me, and it was, in fact, a third to first switch. And so, but it does sort of reconfigure your idea of what the story's about, because John, is first person better for character or for plot, or I mean, let's forget about genre. If you're trying to write a character-based story, is there any difference in writing third and first in terms of how successful you can be in doing character?
I'm a little torn.
Yeah.
I mean, I think first person gives you so much of the character's interiority from their perspective, but with third person, you can actually delve as deep in their mind as you want and actually ignore their own inability to see things and to characterize things differently than they themselves might do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think both of them have a lot of potential for character. It comes, I think it's just for me, POV just seems to getting back to what is the story you're trying to tell, what do you want readers to pick up from it, and what do you think is the most fruitful way to project what you want them to get from the story.
What do you think, John? Is first person better for character than third person?
Well, it depends what you mean by better. I mean, it depends on the character.
Sure.
Because it depends on what is the most interesting thing about the character. Because the most interesting thing about the character is how the character sees herself, then the first person might be better. But what is interesting is, for example, the dissonance between how the character sees herself and how other people see her. That might be easier to do if you're not so much locked inside her head.
Right.
But it's not as funny.
No. I mean, yes, I agree.
Seeing how other people see the character from within the character's head when the character doesn't see it herself is funnier.
Right, but it's much harder.
It is hard because you have to signal the reader that this is what you're trying to do.
That's
as
hard.
opposed to,
But that's not an excuse. That's not a reason.
No,
I think there's also a convention we follow, first person, which is important, which is you're following the fiction that your narrator is a better storyteller than most people really are.
Yeah, but I'm a better storyteller than most people really are.
And I'm Huckleberry Finn written by a real semi-literate 13-year-old.
Well, we've been tossing these rather technical terms around as if everyone understands them, and I want to take a moment just to, this is the definition point of the program here. So first
We need to do
person.
that in third person.
Yeah, we should be. the moderator said that, no, so first person, as you probably know, as you all know, is when the narrator is the I, and so I am explaining to you how my story is unfolded. Second person, which you haven't talked about other than to say that it's impossible or too confusing to do, can be done. I've done it a couple of times. It's just very, I mean, all the things that are limiting in first person are even more, in some ways, limiting in second person. And it is a confusing and it's difficult, I think more difficult for a reader to accept a second person narration, although there's been many successful ones. And then there's third person. And so there's various people, there's levels of degree of distance in third person. And so some people have formulated these, and I actually like to do a little experiment. This gentleman here, would you please stand up in the pink shirt? Yeah. Your name, please. That's right. With orange shoes.
Yes.
All right, your name is what?
Scott Edelman.
Okay,
Yes.
so here is a distant.
How distant does it need to be?
Person. On Thursday, July 11th, the gray-haired man sat in the second row of Salon G. He watched the panelists enter. So this is a distant point of view. Here's a little bit closer. Scott Edelman settled into his seat as the panelists took their places, and then opened his program book, and read their biographies, impatient for them to begin. So here, he's still the same person, he's still in the same room, but we have just a little piece of his mentality here, what he's thinking. Here we're getting a little closer. As the panelists filtered in, Scott hoped that this would be a better panel than the last one he had just suffered through. So we have a little bit of backstory, more inside of his head. And finally, here's what many people call close third person. Scott stifled a groan as the last panelist climbed onto the stage. Not Jim Kelly again. That guy likes the sound of his own voice.
The man's a mind reader, I tell you, a mind reader.
Closer with it. Not Jim Kelly again. Scott Edelman thought as he settled into his seat.
Now, Scott Edelman ejaculated. You left that part out there.
So that's a good point, Eileen, but I think that actually is a little bit more distant, and here's the reason why. So there's this thing that's been floating around recently, I mean, not recently, but it's called indirect discourse, or free indirect discourse. And so when you say that Jim Kelly, Scott thought, that's actually a little bit more distant because we know exactly that Scott Edelman had that thought.
You don't even have to say that. You can just say, not Jim Kelly again.
Which is what I did in the
Scott Edelman settled into his seat.
Yes, it could be that too, but here it says, he stifled a groan as the last panelist climbed onto the table. Not Jim Kelly again. That guy really likes the sound of his own voice. Well, wait a minute. Who's saying that? Whose thought is that?
Okay.
So in free indirect discourse, in this very close third person, you're practically in first person because you have access to his thoughts, but there's no he thought, he hoped, he blah, 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 blah.
It can turn into pseudo-dialogue.
It can turn into pseudo-dialogue, and I think one of the things that's really interesting is the way that this free indirect discourse mode of close third person is actually getting at first person kind of look and feel, because the other thing going on here is that even though it says, not Jim Kelly again, that guy really likes the sound of his own voice, or he doesn't. It's Scott Edelman's thought, but it's also, there's a piece of that is also the narrator's thought at the same time. And so there's this interesting, not distance, but frisson of who's actually, where's this sentence coming from? And on the other hand, it feels very natural when you read it on the page. And so this is a kind of thing where third person, I think, is getting closer to first person. Is this one of the things you were going to talk about when you were saying, the granularity of is that what you said? No. But, yeah, right.
It's actually not my turn, but I'm going to roll because it's in there.
Please do.
To take a step back here, one of the things that Mariah's working on in her dissertation, which I wanted to get a few bits of, is that she wants to break down the first, second, third person ideas and say that what really point of view is all about is a combination of perspective, character relationships, and structure of the narrative itself. So all those things are what actually makes it. It's not just one like narrative, disembodied narrator's perspective or characterization. It's all these elements working together. So granularity is actually pretty much what you're talking about here. And what that actually is, I think, shows, as you just said, is that you can see this sort of lead towards sort of a more first person, and so that it's less of that sort of disembodied God telling us what Scott thinks, and more like direct access to Scott. So in a sense, it's first person, but he's not telling the story. Right. So you've actually changed the narrator from Scott as narrator to us observing Scott as the narrator.
Right.
And this can actually apply to second person too, where we have to make second person as a generalized you, when in fact, someone wrote a book a couple years ago, whose name now escapes me, who made an observation that in what we have is sort of the corpus of second person stories, there's you the agent versus you the observer. And that actually the observer almost becomes more of a first person kind of thing, you the agent, more of a third person, so there's more of a blending there. That's sort of the idea of granularity. There's definitely this bleed between the perspectives.
I wrote a second person story in which I was telling my character that there's an implied narrator who I guess is me, and I'm saying, you wake up in the morning and you look over and your wife is gone. You wonder where she went. I mean, so you're actually talking to the character, but you're in that character's point. You don't know. You try to stay inside that character's point of view.
You're not talking to the reader.
No, you're not talking to the reader. On the other hand, I've written stories where I am talking to the reader, like, you think, well, it's like Dave Million, the classic story by Fred Cole. He's talking to you the whole time, saying, this is a story you may have heard before about a boy and a girl, except boy isn't really a boy and a girl isn't really a girl, and it's happening a million years from now. This is a story you can't really imagine because you're living now and you're not living in the future, which is a very interesting.
And then just do readering.
Yeah, well, it's their readering, but I mean, so what point of view is that? I mean, it's.
Well, what is the body of the story? Is the body of the story like that, or does it?
Yeah,
only...
no, the whole point of the story is that Paul is saying that in this far future, I'm going to try to explain to you how these people live, but you are living in 1970s.
That's an author omniscient theory reader.
Yeah.
And then it's like, we get into Scott's head, but if the same narrator gets into other people's heads all around, then we've got a kind of omniscient, which is harder to do. But if you think about what's in Future King, it's written that way. Keep dipping into, in single scenes, it keeps dipping into one guy's head, another guy's head, another guy's head. And it's basically all T.H. White telling us to start. And that is a very hard technique to pull. He can do it. Right. I would not recommend it for most people. Well, he's able to achieve intimacy while jumping around between heads, which is the hard part.
And
that's the definition of third person omniscient.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a mode of storytelling that is ancient, but also is very much out of favor now. And it's interesting to wonder why is that we don't have these. I mean, that T.H. White pulls this off, and Homer does it well, but most of us don't bother.
It does it very oral. Basically, it's the voice of the storyteller telling you the story. It is certainly the voice of the pre-literate storyteller telling you the story, or of the ancient writer who is basically writing the text to be read aloud. And for the longest time, until they started to actually refine these things, the only point of view was that anymore. It's a purely author's voice. I am the author telling you the story. I'm going to tell you what he's thinking. I'm going to tell you what he's thinking. I'm going to tell you what she gets at. But I, as author speaker, can do that. So, omniscient, is this anything you've ever been interested in, either of you guys? I mean, it is like the most ancient, and it goes back a long time, and it is a difficult thing to pull off. But
well, the lovely thing about being a relatively new writer is I get to say I've never managed to pull it off, but it doesn't come for something quite as Oh no, I mean, like I do a lot of stuff where I write and I go, oh well, that was an interesting experiment. Something was weakness, and then some of it are experiments that all come from it because now you can actually use somebody else's head without getting
right, yeah.
I am a work in progress.
Well, I mean, this is something we see a lot, is that there are multiple points of view, but is that really a true omniscient? I mean, there's another part to this God omniscient, and that is the narrator knows everything. So the narrator can in any moment speak up and say, well, Scott was born in 1927, but and And I think one of the reasons why this is a devalued, I'm just throwing this out for controversial purposes here, is that I don't think that there's any ground for an omniscient narrator to stand on anymore. There's no consensus reality where somebody can say, this is exactly the fact. I mean, you can talk about some things, but once you start talking a little bit more about, the history of humankind or the nature of men and women's relationship, there's no ground to stand on for an omniscient author to actually say, this is the way things are, trust me, I'm God, and so this is...
Well, I don't think anybody still PH20 doesn't do it. I recently read the oldest novel in the world, and it's written that way.
Which is?
The oldest novel in the world is something called Color Road by Sheridan and Aphrodisiacs. I wrote an article about this in the New York Review of Science Fiction. It's a group trash romance, written probably, well, we're not sure if it's contemporaneous with Julius Caesar or contemporaneous with Nero, but it's sort of in there. About the year one on average. And it's a sort of Perils of Pauline type. You have the basic plot is that you have boy meets girl, she's the most beautiful girl in the world, he's a schmuck, they get married, things go wrong, he doesn't deserve her, he later comes, while the two lovers are wandering all over the world, getting enslaved and escaping and all that sort of stuff, he finally becomes worthy of her and performs heroic deeds, and at one point the author breaks in and says, don't worry, you reader, this is going to have a happy ending. And, if you've never read an ancient Greek novel, think of Shakespeare's Pericles, who's got a plot derived from one. It's that kind of stuff. But basically all of the ancient fiction writers that we have, that's basically what they do. The closest thing to the invention of point of view, this is something worth mentioning here, derived from that point of view, is in The Golden Ass by Apuleius, which is basically a Terry Pratchett novel from the 2nd century. The hero has been turned into an ass by the misapplication of magic, and he spent the rest of the book trying to get changed back into human form. And at one point, and there are a lot of embedded episodes within this narrative, at one point our hero is hooked up to one of those grinding machines, we go around and circling and grain, and something dramatic is happening in the manor house. And he says, well, reader, you may wonder how, if I was out there hooked up to the grain grinding machine, I knew what was happening in the manor house. He says, that's because donkeys have very long ears. Anyway, what the point is that the author had thought of it and made a joke out of it. But that's, as far as I can tell, that's the first mention of point of view in literature.
John was talking a minute ago.
Okay. One thing that occurs to me that it's actually a little off topic is that with regard to what you're saying, it seems to me that the more an art form evolves, the more codified it gets in a weird way, the simpler these things become. So that say at the beginning of literature, we're doing all of this head hopping and all of these things that turn out to be very complicated, very complex to analyze. And as we sort of as the art form evolves, we start to have a notion such as point of view, and then we end up with these categorizations like first person, second person, third person. And as a result, what we think of this point of view as being simpler. There's an extremely off-topic analogy that I'm going to get into now, which is that if you look at the advent of musical theater, when musical theater started, nobody really cared about whether the character was singing or whether the actor was singing. So you have these situations where people are singing, and then somebody comes in and compliments on their singing voice, even though this person may have been the character, may actually not be a singer. So in the actual grammatical situation, he probably isn't singing, but then you have this reference to, oh wow, that was a lovely chorus. And actually I just saw the Master Sings of Nuremberg, where you have a similar thing happening where in theory it's opera, so we'll be singing, but it's a scene where they're in theory talking, but then somebody says, well, you just sang 2 good stanzas right there.
Right.
And it seems to me that that's something that you see a lot, say for example, in the musical 20s and 19s and 30s. Well, Nuremberg was earlier, but as you get into modern day musicals, they're also very scrupulously rigorous about whether it's the actor singing or whether it's the character singing. And our model of the correct word is actually diegetic music has become simplified. And I think it's the same sort of thing here, where at the beginning, because there were no rules, we end up with these sort of various complex structures, and as we have sort of imposed rules on ourselves, they simplify. That doesn't make any sense.
It does, you know, go ahead.
Me.
Go.
My mother was an artist, and she used to say to me when I was a small child, you have to know the rules so you can choose which ones you want to break. And I think what you're talking about is a bunch of rules that people, I don't think everything is codified, and we have to always do it any one way. People get into habits of doing it one way. As there is a lot of theory about something, more and more people do it the way the theory points them. I like to think that I've tried to break all that. It's probably my mother's influence, but I really have never learned a rule that I didn't want to see if I could do it somebody different. And as I said, I'm not a theoretician. I'm working on a novel right now, which if I finish it will be the first one I've finished. And when I get into a hard place, I try to voice in a different person and see where that takes me. I don't know what the finished novel, what voice or voices the finished novel will be in, but the different voices take me in different directions.
I think what I'm hearing is, in part, so artists want to invent, they want to experiment, and so they try different things. And so when you first start, for instance, if you're going to try to interpolate thoughts into a third person, you say, as we said earlier, Scott thought, but not Jim Kelly again, Scott thought. And so, but that's sort of a clanking, you don't really need that he thought, except the first time that you do it, you do, because no one's ever seen that before, and they're going to wonder where that came from. So as you experiment, and also readers accept these innovations that you do, you can sort of leave out some of the steps until all of a sudden you're in this very close third person, which reads just like first person, which is actually becoming more like, there is a sort of melding of the points of view. And the only reason you can do that is because somebody started, a long time ago with the sort of clanking, pointing at that, then somebody else refined it, and all of a sudden you've got actors singing in a musical, and you don't really question why that's happening, because, from the point of view of stagecraft, you say, well, why is that guy singing? But from the point of view of you've seen enough musicals, you've seen that work before, you accept it. And so, I think this is one of the things that you were talking about with this, or that Mariah's talking about, with the way that these points of view are becoming more and more similar. So I have a question though. This is something that I see a lot. I actually teach writing, and I see a lot in student manuscripts, and that is short stories especially. I think this is where I get sort of annoyed, where the author resorts to multiple points of view in a short story, and sometimes as many as 3 or 4.
I know you counted me for that.
Is that a weakness or is that a strength, or maybe what it is that when I was a kid, when I started out, that was a weakness, but now so many people have done it that people just accept it.
Depends on what the story's about.
Yeah.
To think about, actually, one example is particularly we think about because the magazine version messes up. Harlan Ellison's Beats and Shadows Love in the Heart of the World. The story with multiple points of view in a short story is probably about a pattern of events. It's about how this central event affected that person, that person, that person, and that person, and they all come together.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good reason for having multiple points of view. Otherwise, probably not. Certainly, it's something you should certainly, I would tell a student to make sure you have an actual reason for doing this, not just because you got bored with the first one and you wanted to change. Because the weakness of this approach is that if you really want empathy with a character and you switch point of view, you just unwound the mainspring and you got to start over.
Well, the key is you've got to get away with it. You're going to break the rules. You've got to put in extra energy and get away with it.
You have to stick the landing.
Anything you can get away with, I would say, anything you can get away with is valid. But this is why I would never discourage students from writing first person, because it's not the first stories I ever sold were in first person. First of all, if you can make the narrative voice convincing, you characterize it in each first story you will sell will be in the first person because, like a 3,000 word story, a very simple elementary story may work that way. I would certainly never discourage it. I think Gaiman was absolutely wrong in trying to how that out, you know. I'm going to say probably about 75% of the stories I wrote are first person.
What did I do
You've commenting into the ground for every story. It's not anything unusual.
No, but I'm interested in this notion that in a short story, I know you can do it if you can get away with it, but did you get away with it ultimately? Do you think?
Yeah.
Cool. There you go. Say no more. How about some questions from the audience? I saw some hands. Whoa! All right, Ken, you had your hand up before, so let's
Yeah, I just want to kind of disagree about about the omniscient point of view, utility in the contemporary world. The best use of the omniscient third-person point of view I have seen came out last year in J.K. Rowling's The Casual Vacancy, in which the multiple points of view of different characters are used. You're in the heads of all of them, and the reason why you have to be is because the entire point of the novel is that these people do not understand each other.
Mm-hmm.
Is that none of them understands any of the rest of them. And that is why you couldn't have written the novel any other way. It would have fallen to pieces if you weren't in these different points of view, because what you need is that dissonance between those different points of view. So, and also just any sentence that begins, we're different now than they were then, and so we can't use that. Maybe I just don't believe that premise.
So let me ask you this though, your experience of reading it, did you ever at one point say to yourself, whoa, this is kind of different, or this isn't something that she has to win you over to that because it is kind of an oddball style, and so did it happen immediately, or did you have to work your way into it?
As soon as, I think it was relatively early on in the novel, as soon as I got the point that character B saw character A completely different than character A saw herself, that I was hooked, because I recognized this was going to be the structure of the novel, and in fact it was the structure of the novel, relentlessly to the point where you almost couldn't bear reading it any longer because it got so excruciating.
And so that's J.K. Rowling's title of
The Casual Vacancy.
The Casual Vacancy. That J.K. Rowling, she's written a bunch of books. Here.
Early in the panel, you, Darrell, second person singular, you brought up briefly Huckleberry Finn, and you said how difficult it would have been to write it in the first person.
No, I said how difficult to write it in the first person. It is in the first person, but I said in the first person, you have to maintain the artificial convention that your narrator is a better storyteller than most people really are. And most people, when they tell you about their lives and so on, they go on and on and go on tangents, there'll be a lot of exposition in it, and most simulator 13-year-olds are not as engaging of narrators as I've finished.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. Back to the question.
Yes. Okay. Well, there is an exception to that. 20th century science fiction writer wrote about a semi-literate, mentally challenged adult, Flowers for Algernon.
Right.
Told entirely in the first person.
But we're still
very powerful.
Yes, and we're also still cheating, because the reason why you're cheating is we're leaving out the uninteresting parts. My guess is you really had a mentally challenged person trying to tell you the story would ramble all over the place. One of the things you do in a first-person narration is to leave out the interesting parts. Where can you see this demonstrated very well is in a book I otherwise don't recommend. There's a book called Writing Popular Fiction by Bean Foods. I can remember when I was at Clarion, we had a copy of this floating around, and we were shocked at how cynical it was and so on. But there was a very good section in there about dialogue. And he gave a scene the way people really talk. And then he gave a scene the way you would put it in a story, leaving the book parts out. And I think in a first-person narration, what you're doing is you're basically editing that first-person narration to leave the boring parts out.
But I did that in third person too.
Yeah.
That's kind of the point of being a writer.
Yeah.
Besides, Flowers for Algernon could not have been written as well or as powerfully from any other character's point of view.
I would agree with you, but I think they basically, the authors were very, very carefully editing that. It's not quite a realistic point of view. It's like edited highlights of the point of view.
Yeah, if you're dealing with a damaged point of view or an incomplete point of view, then your job of work is to get as much of it on the page as you can without doing the parts that aren't very interesting.
Also, if first-person narrators, this is one of the pitfalls of first-person narrators, but I didn't understand your question earlier about did I ever change point of view. I once read a story, which was actually published on, but it begins with a first-person narrator who's done something very bad and feels very badly about it, and in the first person, well, after a while, he started to whine. And I realized this story isn't going anywhere. It's turning into a kind of feel better for yourself exposition. No. And the way I solved this problem was by having, and that's basically come into a bar and tell it to his best friend. And so that about a third of the way through the story, the best friend takes over as narrator and shoves the guy out the door and makes things happen. Because if the guy had really just gone on telling what he felt, that's all we get, it wouldn't make a story. So basically I had to make one first-person narration collide with the other when we get the story moving.
Interesting. Okay, good.
Well, actually, my question I think, picks up perfectly from what you just said, because I have a question about how far into a story you can go before you have to show the reader what the most daring thing is you're going to do with point of view. So does it have to be...
The reader shouldn't know what you're doing with point of view. Whatever. Seriously, you should. The reader should not be reading and thinking, "Whoa, what a daring thing to do with point of view."
That was my that's my point. That how early in the story do you have to put that so that the reader will just accept it? Because obviously, if you switch to second person on the last page of your book, they're going to go, "Oh my God, what?"
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I think if you can get away with it, that would be an interesting thing to try. To do everything in third or first person, and then just the very last paragraph. And somebody must have done it. It
There has
sounds
to be a
like it
logical
does.
reason for it.
right.
Yeah.
Somebody just did a second-person novel. I heard about that. I think it's Kevin Hosseini, actually. I heard
Well,
about this on
Kierkegaard just did
NPR.
a novel in which he never used the same word twice,
Yeah.
including the and ah.
Yeah, well,
You can do these things, but it doesn't mean that.
I heard something about it. Kevin wrote an entire novel in the second person.
Well,
But that used to letter E, remember that? Entire novel.
Yeah, right. Okay, back here.
Is there a distinction between third person and omniscient?
The question again, what is the difference between third person and omniscient?
Is there a difference?
Yes.
Absolutely, because in third person, well, in close third person or limited third person, you pick a character and you're in that person's head throughout the entire story. In omniscient, you are free to jump into anyone's head in the story, any character, and you also may have access to information that no other character can know. You can, know what the, pi is out to the gajillionth place. If that's something that's interesting to the, relevant to the story, none of the characters need to know that, but in your omniscient point of view, that's totally legit. It is a kind of a trick, though.
But it is a category of third person.
Yeah, sure. Well, third person, yeah. Okay.
There's no fourth person or fifth person. You're going to be in one of the three.
Oh, yeah, right.
There's a series of definitions of very person. It basically has to do with where the eyes and ears are. Basically, one form of third person is you are in somebody's head. Right, the word for it. You could also do a third person from the point of view of a set of eyes and ears fixed to the wall. Basically sees what's happening. Or you can look down, there's God looking down on everyone, or you can have a third person that just follows one person around. It basically is a question of sort of where the camera is.
Yeah, we didn't talk about this, but I mentioned it briefly. There's a third person cinematic point of view where you're in nobody's head and you just describe what's happening in the room, what they do, only the things that a camera could observe. Camera point of view is something cool. Yeah, and so and this is basically what every movie and every play is, except for those that have narration. So if you think about how difficult that is to convey, it is a challenge. Right here.
So I have a variant on this question, which is rotating third person limited versus omniscient. Is there a difference?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're at. Rotating
When
third.
people talk about omniscient, when people talk about omniscient, they generally talk about switching points of view within a scene.
Right.
And when they talk about rotating third person, they usually mean switching points of view between scenes or between chapters.
Yes.
Okay, so which was casual reading?
It's omniscient, because in some individual scenes, you're actually bouncing from head to head to head.
This is not uncommon, but it also is something that is frequently less common. because it's hard to do. That's 5 minutes. We still got 5 minutes.
So jumping around to another J.K. Rowling moment. Would Harry Potter be third person woman? What kind of? There are scenes, like for example, where suddenly Harry's not in the scene, but we're knowing what's going on.
Very rarely, though.
Well, it's like very rarely.
Not a whole lot of great mind reading in that.
Yeah. It's usually in those novels, you stay in Harry's head with usually the exception of maybe the first chapter, where to bring in some bit of backstory or some narrative you somebody else said. But throughout almost all those novels, you are firmly in Harry's
It's
head.
unusual enough that when it happens, you notice it, that you know something that Harry doesn't know all of a sudden.
Right, and so unless you're doing it consistently, it may throw you out of the story. And so if that's the case, then it's a flaw. I mean, you.
Or it's an experiment.
It's an experiment. Sure, okay. Over here.
So FM must use the roots of man, which is between first person and third person. I personally found it a little disconcerting, and I didn't really feel like I got into the first person point of view's head. What do the rest of you think?
Well, I don't know. Did anyone else read this? Okay, so let me just say, in general, and this is the point we made before, when you switch points of view, you ask the reader to reset his expectations of what's about to happen and what can happen and who we should be paying attention to. Every time you ask the reader to reset, for some readers anyway, they realize that they're reading a story and they're feeling like, oh, well, okay, what time is it? I think this is one of the things that breaks the spell of a story when you do this. So when you do it effectively, it doesn't throw the reader out of the story. Apparently, since it was a problem for you, this technique was an experiment. Perhaps it did not work. I mean, but this is something that people try all the time because writers feel constrained. They want to write outside the box. Back here. And then back there, but here in between your please.
Do you know of examples of third-person omniscient narrations where the narrator has such a strong personality that he could actually be considered a character?
I'm thinking of like Henry Fielding or something like that. I mean,
You mean where the author voice?
Oh,
well, Henry James, you think so? Yeah.
Well, C.S. Lewis does that on purpose.
Okay. Right. So we've read C.S. Lewis and Henry somebody.
It's kind of in children's books.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right. Sure. Back here in the blue shirt, please.
Theodore Sturgeon wrote a story. I think the name of it is The Man Who Lost the Sea, in which he varies between second-person narration and third-person narration, because the central character in the story, not to do a spoiler, but his spaceship just crashed, and he's practically on the verge of an out-of-body experience. And he's trying to, or he isn't really trying to tell the story, but Sturgeon is trying to tell the story about him, the way he might try to tell it to you. You know, you would do this. When you were at this age, you might do this. And then, well, the man over there, is that me? You know, this is what he looks like. But this is a particular case that really works well.
All right, we have a recommendation for this story, and it is a classic story, and please, I guess I have not read it, but I heard it. So, back here in the red shirt. Oh, right. Okay, yes.
As we're coming on the end,
Sure.
I'd like to make a statement that I feel that too much focus has been on telling stories that don't challenge the reader, telling stories that don't throw the reader out of the book. The reader's thrown out of the book. Why did you do that? Did you mean to do it or not mean to do it? The author should always be intentional. But, you know, James Joyce violated all of these rules. There are plenty of writers who break all of these supposed rules. And it's okay. It's okay to write only for a part of the group instead of the universe of every reader.
Amen.
Amen, sister. No, it's true though. And this is something that we talk about in writers' workshops a lot. Like, oh my gosh, this is such a clever story, and the writers are all grooving on it, and then somebody will say, but who will like the story? Who will read the story? And you know, the fact of the matter is that writers are eager to try to see what they can do and see what test the limits of what narrative can, to stretch the narrative as far as it can be stretched. And so I'm totally down with that. And I'm also recognizing that sometimes those stories are the stories that, you know, people don't remember because they were too difficult.
Well, don't you think it doesn't matter whether or not the writer's showing up or does it really doesn't say?
I think what he's trying to say here is stop, because that's what the sign says, so thank you very much.